You're tuning in to Financial Fitness NW live on 1150 KKNW. We provide our listeners with local charities and business to bring solutions to your daily life and provide you with opportunities to give back to your community as well. Now in studio, we have Dr. Olson. He's a founder of Presage Biosciences and Blaze Bioscience, the tumor paint company. His team invented chlorotoxin-based tumor paint, which led to the clinical candidate BLZ-100, developed by Blaze Bioscience and currently in human trials. Dr. Olson earned his Ph.D. in pharmacology in 1989 and an MD, I'm sorry, in 1991, both from the University of Michigan. He completed his residency in pediatrics in 94 and his fellowship in pediatrics oncology in 97, both at the University of Washington. And he's currently a full member at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, a professor at the University of Washington, and an attending physician at Children's Hospital in Seattle. So welcome, Dr. Olson.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wow, we know you're really smart when we can barely read your bio.
Too many big words. Yikes.
Whoa, I was glad I didn't have that one. We're so glad to have you in studio and share the amazing cutting-edge things you guys are doing. So first off, I think, could you just kind of tell us about the Tumor Paint Company and what that is, how you got started with that?
Sure. So it all began in 2004 when I had a patient who was a 16-year-old girl who had a type of aggressive brain tumor. And the surgeons operated on her for 16 hours.
Wow.
And, you know, the goal in pediatric brain surgery is to get as much cancer as you can out and take out as little normal brain as possible so you don't harm the patient. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, after that long surgery, there was a big piece of cancer left behind because the surgeons thought that it was normal brain and they didn't want to paralyze her or cause harm. So that day, we decided to figure out a way to make the cancer light up. We had absolutely no idea how we were going to do that. But over the next 6 weeks, we came up with an idea. And the idea involved using this protein that comes from the Israeli deathstalker scorpion to deliver a little molecular flashlight. And we grew a human brain tumor on the back of a mouse and injected what we called tumor paint into the tail vein of the mouse. And an hour later, the cancer was bright green, and the rest of the mouse wasn't glowing. So we knew we were onto something.
Wow. How would you even come up with this venom? I mean, where did that, in 6 weeks, how did you guys figure that out? Does someone, know about venoms?
Well, no, it's kind of a crazy story. Patrick Gabikian was a neurosurgeon who came to work in my lab on this project, and he wanted to do his own experiments to find out what was different for the brain tumor compared to the normal brain. And I said, Patrick, you're a neurosurgeon, but you're not Superman. I think you're only here for a year. And if you do those experiments, you'll barely get done, and we won't actually be able to make progress toward the actual product that we want to bring into patients. So I said, what I'd like you to do instead is to go on the computer every day and read everything that everybody else has done that looks at differences between brain tumors and normal brain. And I want you to come back to me with your priority list each day of what you think we should try to use. And we did this every day for 6 weeks. He'd come into my office around 6 at night. And he'd say, these are the 50 things I looked at. These are my top 3 candidates. This is why I think that they would be good candidates. And every day I would shoot those down because I could see where the experiments were going to fail at some point, having, a little gray hair. And at that time, now it's a lot, I could see where each of these was going to not progress. And so each day I'd send him back to the drawing board, and he kept saying, I want to do my own experiments. I'm like, no. There's people that do this kind of work, and they publish a list, but they don't know what to do with it, And after about 6.5 weeks, he came back to me, and he said, well, now we're totally scraping the bottom of the barrel. All I've got for you is I found this work that was done down in University of Alabama, Birmingham. They were studying how chloride, what's in table salt, gets in and out of our cells. And the way that you study these ions in science is to use venoms, because when scorpions paralyze their prey, they release these little mini proteins that block ion channels, so chloride can't get into a cell. And so that's people literally were milking scorpions.
Oh my gosh!
You tape them to your desk. You put a little electrode on its stinger, and a drop of venom comes out, and they would isolate that into little fractions. And some of those fractions block chloride ion channels, some block sodium, some block potassium.
Wow.
And it just so happened that they were using brain tumor cells to do these studies.
Oh, my goodness.
And they recognized that this was binding to brain tumor cells. And so we said, that would be really interesting to try that, to attach a fluorescent tag to it, inject it into the tail vein of a mouse and see if it goes to the cancer. And so I promised him that if it didn't work, he could do his own experiments.
He was probably so excited that day that you're like, you like this idea, right?
Yeah. So we tried it, and it lit up, and the two of us were dancing in the hallways at Fred Hutch. I mean, how often do you have two grown men dancing?
That's awesome.
It really was. It was fantastic. It's the beginning of what has now been a 13-year campaign to develop this for human patients. And so we took it as far as we could at Fred Hutch. And then it started to get to the point where the next steps were things like manufacturing and a 3,200-page document that had to go to the FDA. And my team really didn't have that expertise. So fortunately, Heather Franklin led a team over at a company called Zymogenetics that had just been acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb. And she brought her team with her over, and they started Blaze Bioscience. And Hutch licensed the technology to Blaze. And so they've really done the heavy lifting on making the clinical product and getting it into human clinical trials. And now we've treated over 80 patients, including over 20 kids, because kids inspired this and because their families did so much to make it happen in the early days by raising money to fund the experiments. We've kept kids on par with adults. And usually drug companies will develop a drug for adults and usually don't even go back to kids to do clinical trials or that unless they're forced. Of all the drugs that I used to treat kids with brain tumors, only one is actually approved for use in kids, and all the rest we have to use off-label. So at Blaze and at Fred Hutch, we've decided that we're going to keep kids in the forefront, and we're going to try to get our first FDA approval for kids with brain tumors, even before we go after the big markets that could, really help potentially 250,000 patients a year with cancer.
That's amazing. Wow. So you said this started 13 years ago.
Exactly, yeah.
How long does it normally take to get it to be an approved?
We're right on the usual timeline.
Are you?
Yeah, so it's usually in the range of 15 to 20 years from the time the idea is conceived until you have an FDA approval.
Wow, that speaks volumes for why people are going through all these trials and things. It's like if you just can stay healthy. And then, because who knows what's on the cusp? Who knows what's coming, right? Because it's like 15, 20 years in the making to get these things approved for people to be using, right?
And we've really seen that a lot in the last few years. I think that people don't really understand how much we are on this precipice of having huge advances. We've had some of those recently. Some of the CAR T-cell therapy that was developed at Fred Hutch and Seattle Children's was being developed over the course of like 30 years. And when that came to fruition, they treated the first patients with it, these kids with cancer that had come back 4 or 5 times. They were in hospice care.
Oh.
And I saw one of those guys 4 weeks after he had CAR T-cells, and he looked like he was on a basketball team. He looked so healthy.
Wow.
And he had been in hospice in the ICU, and he got a tablespoon of his own cells that were genetically modified and put back into his body, and they went after the cancer and completely cleared it. So, know, with that initial molecule those initial T cells that they made, they have like a 93% complete response rate, and most of those patients are alive and cancer-free 2 years after they were treated. So, I mean, that's
amazing,
huge impact, and it was discovered here locally at Fred Hutch and Seattle Children's.
That's so awesome. Aren't we pretty? I mean, Seattle's pretty high up there as far as the research and.
We really are. It's some people have called Fred Hutch the crown jewel of the National Comprehensive Cancer Centers because, we're only a tenth of the size of some of the other centers, but our impact has been so outsized compared to that.
Wow.
I mean, to have 3 Nobel laureates on our faculty and to have discovered bone marrow transplantation, this CAR T-cell therapy, tumor paint, and so many other things. The Women's Health Initiative that saves 20,000 women a year from getting breast cancer because they recommend it against estrogen replacement following menopause. There's just every cylinder's firing over that place.
That's incredible, and you're part of it.
Yeah,
it's fun to be part of it.
On the cutting edge.
So let's talk a little bit more in depth about the tumor paint. So how it benefits, the client, the doctor when you guys are in there doing surgery. So how does it really work, and Are you guys seeing a lot of success with it?
Yeah, so I'm going to be really careful in how I answer this question, partly
Okay.
because the FDA is studying this right now, and I need
Okay.
to make sure I don't step on their toes, let them do their job.
Yeah,
So,
don't do that.
so what I'll say is that we have now treated over 80 patients. We haven't seen any dose-limiting toxicity, meaning we haven't had anybody have a side effect that even caused us to pause and say, boy, maybe we shouldn't be treating with this. So,
Wow.
it's really been, like the worst we've seen is minor headaches or a little queasy stomach in all those patients, which is great. That's the first step, right? Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that in almost every type of brain cancer, most of the cancers are lighting up, and that it's straightforward to distinguish the cancer from the normal tissue when you look at it with the device that we use. So again, I just want to report, what's been out there in the literature. There was a national meeting a few weeks ago where they reported that tumor paint was used here in Bellevue and at the University of Washington here at Overlake Hospital, and it was used in women with breast cancer.
Oh.
And interestingly, a third of women who have breast cancer surgery get a call like 2 weeks later, and they're told that there was cancer cells too close to the margin, and they either have to come back for another surgery, which is a huge deal, or they have to have more intensive therapy. And the reason that they miss so many margins is because when they're doing the operation, they have to suspend the operation. The woman is under anesthesia. Everybody steps back from the table. They send the tissue down to pathologist, and the pathologist is supposed to do sectioning and staining and looking under the microscope and tell them whether they got enough or not, because you can't tell the difference between cancer and normal breast tissue.
Right.
Wow.
Most of us think that it's easy for a surgeon to see these things, but you really can't. Well, with tumor paint, I believe it was 12 out of 13 women, their cancers lit up, and the normal breast around it did not light up. And so, when I said that we could help as many as 250,000 patients a year, that's a step in that direction, is to learn that it works not only for pediatric brain tumors, but for that type of cancer. And then we've done a clinical trial in patients with skin cancer, melanoma. And in our preclinical work, the work that we've done before we got to human patients, we saw activity in prostate cancer, colon cancer, many types of cancer. So we're hoping that turns out to be true in human patients as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you could use that just across the board, it just seems like that's just amazing.
Yeah, there really hasn't been a major advance in cancer surgery in probably half a century, and the fact is it's the first step in eliminating cancer. And it's important for most cancers, for many cancers, you don't have to get every cell out. That's why we use chemotherapy and radiation and immunotherapy and these other things. But you really want to get out the bulky disease, because if you have big chunks of cancer left behind, those communities work with each other to become resistant to chemotherapy and radiation therapy. So we're hoping that tumor paint will help surgeons take out as much cancer as they possibly safely can to help guide their surgical judgment, and then to leave behind normal tissues that are really important, particularly things like the brain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Wow.
So, so tell us a little bit about Project Violet. How
Sure.
does that come into play?
So this also goes back to our early work, where when we first discovered this, and even after we had data in mice that had cancer showing that the cancers lit up, I wrote several grants, and all of the grants were denied because grants are reviewed by other scientists around the country, and they were skeptical that we could pull this off. They thought, oh, this is highly ambitious. It may not work. You might not get it done in the time frame of the grant. And our patient families said, if that's the problem, you stay focused on the science, and we're going to raise some money to help you guys out. And so they started having chili cook-offs and golf tournaments and greeting card sales. And altogether, those families initially raised $8 million to help us
Wow.
out of those kind of events. There's no big checks in there. These
That's
were,
amazing.
literally chili cook-offs in people's garages.
That's crazy.
And this is how much this community cares about kids with cancer, that they put up that $8 million. So when we transferred tumor paint to Blaze Bioscience, then I had an opportunity to reinvent my lab and said, what can we do next? Well, we had a decade of experience working with these molecules, these mini proteins from scorpions. And so we started Project Violet, which is named after a patient that I cared for. And I can tell you that story in a minute if we have
Yeah, we'd
opportunity.
love to hear that.
And with Project Violet, we gave people a chance to go side by side with us as we discovered drugs in nature and tried to turn them into drugs for human patients. And we started out where people could adopt a drug candidate And they would choose a drug that came from a scorpion or a violet or a potato or a tomato or, we even now have a drug candidate that comes from a penguin.
Really?
And sea urchins, and there's just all these amazing things. You think about it, plants and animals can't go to Walgreens when they need a drug, so they have to make it. And if they encode it in their DNA and make proteins, they can pass it down to their children. So the healthiest scorpions get to make baby scorpions and grandbaby scorpions, and so there's evolutionary pressure to make good drugs. And these drugs have potential to be used for human patients. Our team has discovered over 80,000 of these in sources from nature.
Wow.
And Project Violet goes back to that same principle of here the community can help us fill in the gaps where the science isn't quite mature enough yet to get the big NIH grants. So we started Project Violet when I gave a TEDx talk here in Seattle in 2013, and we have since raised somewhere between $10 and $20 million. There's some numbers that are still coming in on it right now.
That's a lot of bowls of chili. That's all I can say.
That's for sure. And what it's allowed us to do is I just hired the 45th scientist on the team.
Wow.
We've built a robot that is making these drug candidates day and night. And we have a really strong engagement on the Project Violet Facebook. So anybody who's listening that wants to go to Project Violet Facebook, they can do that. They want to go to our website. It's projectviolet.org. And just see what we're doing and become part of it. Those people who support us are welcome to come down to the lab and have a tour, meet the scientists, take a look through some of the microscopes, and watch the robot making drugs.
I was going to say, do we get to see the robot? That was going to be my question.
Yeah. So we have open houses, and those in the community who are interested can send us an email through projectviolet.org, and we can invite them to one of the open houses.
So were the families the people that first started with the fundraising, were they families that were affected by cancer?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting that there used to be a time when there was like this brick wall between medicine and fundraising. And, when I was trained, we were told as doctors, absolutely never talk to your patients about fundraising and things like that. And I found that it actually is a really important part of the healing process. If you look across the whole country, parents who have lost a child to cancer or other diseases have somewhere in the range of about a 90% divorce rate because it's so hard for the two parents to support each other, and they grieve in different ways and at different times, and it drives a wedge in a marriage. And among the families that I've cared for, we have about 90% of them are still together.
Wow.
And I think that's because they really form this broader community, and they're around other people who have been through this. When they come to, tomorrow night, we'll have about 20 of these families coming to Sally's in my house for a concert. Naomi Washira will be singing for the patient families. And we have families coming who I cared for 25 years ago, some families 10 years ago, some families that we're treating now that will be there. And so those new families that are going through it now can see families that have been through that path and then get advice, when somebody says, I can't believe he wants to go golfing when we're in this deep, dark, sorrowful place. Another family can say, let him go golfing. That's what he needs to do, and let's go have coffee or a glass of wine instead.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, and really people, they want to do things for other people, especially when they're going through, having a sick kid. We had Footprints for Fight on the show, and her son had a brain tumor at Seattle Children's. And, then she started this foundation and is helping all these families at Seattle Children's.
Exactly, yeah.
So people want to give back.
And it really, one thing to keep in mind is that the numbers are small, so it really takes the whole community. One of the things that I have heard a mom say that really resonated with me is that she's not doing this for her daughter who passed away. She's doing this for her other 3 kids because none of us know when the diagnosis might be around the corner. We all hope that it isn't. But whether it's our family or an extended family or someone in the community that we don't know, what we really have to recognize is that there's no financial incentive for drug companies to create drugs for kids. So we have to do it entirely through philanthropy and other ways of kind of zeroing out these costs. And so the fact that the Seattle community is paying for 45 scientists to work on these kids' behalf, and that these families know that there's an army down at Fred Hutch absolutely hammering away day and night, plus over at Seattle Children's there's another army, that really means a lot and is an important part of the healing.
Well, I would love to hear Violet's story. Do you have time? Can you share that with us really quick?
Yeah, so Violet was a patient that I was taking care of who had a brainstem glioma. The brainstem is what connects our brain to the rest of the body. And when a tumor occurs there, you can't take it out surgically because it fills that whole space. And so every patient who has that kind of cancer passes away. I've never had a child survive in 25 years of doing this. None of my colleagues have ever had a patient survive in 25 years of doing, or in their years of doing this. And so, and we're pretty open with these kids. So Violet knew that she was going to die. She had seen the donor mark on her mom's license, and she said, Dr. Olson, how come you don't know more about my kind of cancer so that you could cure me? And I said, well, the problem is that your kind of cancer doesn't have surgery, so we don't get tissue. Mm-hmm. And so, it really makes it hard to study it. And she said, well, when I die, I want you to take my tumor out, and I want you to make research tools from it and share it with scientists all over the world. And I thought that was the most selfless thing I'd ever heard coming from a little 10-year-old girl. And because of that, I wanted Project Violet to be named for her. It's the coolest science we were ever doing. And I thought, here's this little girl who grew up in kind of out in the woods in the Olympic Peninsula and loved nature. And we were creating drugs from violets. And it all kind of just came together that this is what we need to do.
That is such a beautiful story. Gosh.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Really amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here and for all the
oh my gosh. Yes,
amazing work that you're doing.
It's been a true pleasure.
So great. Thank you for tuning in to Financial Fitness Northwest. When we come back from the break, Sarah and I will be discussing the home buying process for first-time home buyers, as well as changes that buyers who have not purchased a home in the last 5 years might not be familiar with. To find out more about any topics discussed on today's show, you can find us online at www.financialfitnessnw.com.